Previously, on Murdaugh Mafia Rise and Fall, Bootlegging Buster, we found Buster and 29 others indicted in the Colleton Whiskey Conspiracy. We saw that he pulled up to the courthouse in his long black limousine, parked in a spot reserved for court officials, and walked in with his senator uncle on one side and his House of Representatives lawyer on the other. His arraignment had been delayed 3 times, and he had been able to continue prosecuting in court in spite of his indictment up until this trial. We heard the accusations put against him of how he'd helped a network of moonshiners know when raids were headed their way, along with the sheriff and 2 deputies, had taken money to protect the bootleggers, promising them lighter sentences should they get caught. We learned that at least one of them was serving time in order to protect Buster. We've heard from 2 eyewitnesses that saw a still and moonshine on the Murdaugh Almeida property, the same property where Alex's parents lived until their recent deaths. And in one of many bombs dropped in Valerie Bauerlein's book, The Devil at His Elbow, we learned that Becky Hill's grandparents were a part of Buster's bootlegging business and were even charged for their crimes. The descendants of everyone involved in that big enterprise are still dribbled all over the area, and they know the truth. Buster ran a bootlegging enterprise, and that's a fact. Today, we're going to hear about the actual trial. Let's get started. I'm Cassidy O'Connell, and this is Murdaugh Mafia Rise and Fall, Episode 8, Bootlegging Buster, Part 2. Prohibition was long over, and there were many ads in the very newspapers that I searched for this case for whiskey. So what was the problem with bootlegging, and why was the federal government involved? It's about tax. We see that when Prohibition ended in 1933, tax on alcohol was $2.20 per 100 proof gallon. In 1955, it had risen to $10.50 per 100 proof gallon, and that greatly increased the cost of a bottle of whiskey. Just like today, anyone wanting to sell alcohol had to get a license. It was already expensive for those times at $500, but it had just been raised to $600 with an extra $2.50 tax on each case. So it was getting very expensive to buy whiskey and very expensive to sell whiskey. And that had brought about a huge uprising of moonshine stills. It was a problem across the nation, but mostly in the southeast of the country. And the second worst was the Midwest. So beginning in the 1950s, the federal government really cracked down on this. There started to be federal investigations. Just before Buster's trial, it had gotten really big. Here's a small list of cases that I found in 1955 alone in this particular region of South Carolina, with bootlegging busts, trials, and articles written about the efforts to stop illegal whiskey production. In addition to these many raids, in some of those articles, it wasn't raids of stills, but cars on the road that were found to be transporting moonshine. And then it got even stricter. Cars coming from out of state were often stopped as well and routinely checked for out-of-state whiskey. South Carolina had all of their legal whiskey tax stamped. At that time, if you were caught with whiskey in the state that did not have a South Carolina tax stamp, it was seized. If you had large quantities of out-of-state whiskey, it could result in a fine or even an arrest. It became a really big controversy that year because a lot of tourists from North Carolina and Georgia would come to vacation in Myrtle Beach. Since whiskey was $1 more in South Carolina, they would bring whiskey from home. Even that was being seized. As they would enter South Carolina with their home whiskey, legally taxed in their own state, it was being seized from them if found in their cars. Myrtle Beach tourism had started to feel the loss as some people were giving up on vacationing there. They weren't really excited about being treated as criminals just for bringing legal whiskey with them on their vacation. So calls were being made to stop that, and later in the year, they had to have pretty good reason to pull you over because the effort was to try to find illegal moonshine. Why did the tax matter so much? Because the tax proceeds were used to support schools and other government agencies. And it was a pretty large amount. For 1955, Columbia received just shy of $124,000 in whiskey tax allocations. Back then, that could really go far. Charleston just over $100,000 and Greenville just under $83,000. 65% of that money went to public schools. 20% went to the counties based on their population, and 15% to incorporated municipalities, also on a population basis. As we know, there wasn't a lot of revenue from factories or other such things in the area. This kind of tax supplemented lower income areas where property taxes were low and there wasn't a lot of tax revenue on other items as seen in larger cities with higher incomes and more purchasing. So, with moonshine and bootlegging, a handful of people profited, but the local areas suffered from losing out on this tax. So in addition to the outlandish lawsuits by the Murdaugh firm that kept businesses away, therefore keeping jobs away, he was also depriving them of this federal tax funding meant to keep schools running and provide the necessary classroom items needed for a well-functioning school. This was a very selfish outlook for one who was supposed to be serving his circuit, but was instead using his power to expand his own wallet. Day 1 started with a banger of a witness and a sudden plea change from innocent to guilty. But before we get into that, look at this. The entire jury was listed in the paper, their names and their locations. Can you imagine? We have these high-level, intimidating defendants. I mean, Buster alone was known as the man who, if you needed someone to disappear, he was the one you'd ask. It's not just him. It's all these other defendants with everything to lose. If that's not enough, then you have the high-level intimidating lawyers. And here were these jurors' names splashed in the newspapers. Make a mental note of the foreperson's name, Alfred R. Goodwin, because we're going to come back to that name later. Now, we heard in the last episode that the jury was sequestered at a hotel in Charleston. But what about their loved ones? We know enough about these corrupt officials now that we can imagine the real fear they must have had for their loved ones out there during this trial. We know threats, intimidation, and bribes were being used, and this listing of jurors is something I haven't come across in all the exhaustive research that I've been doing. Before we get into the first witness's testimony, let's talk about a couple of things that happened that day. First, just before the noon recess, former Deputy David Carter approached the bench with his counsel and said he wanted to change his plea. The court accepted his new plea and asked him to keep himself available in the event that he would need to be called as a witness. The judge also told him that his sentence would be deferred pending the outcome of the trial. Clyde Eltsroth, Buster's law partner, and the ENPMPED had originally planned to serve as both counsel and a witness. That was solved in the morning as well, with the judge telling him he could not be both. It was decided that Gladys would be allowed to sit at Buster's side, and she was described as wearing a brown dress and a tan hat with a jaunty feather. Randolph III also sat with them. He was described as nervously chewing his lip and wearing a type of shoe called a penny loafer, where a penny was put in a slit in the top of the shoe for good luck. No honor among thieves. The biggest news of day one was the testimony of a woman named Edith Freeman. Edith Freeman was the wife of one of the still operators, Doc Freeman. He was a man she described as not knowing how to read or write, which limited his work options. He had been a moonshiner in the past, had stopped for a while, but was unable to find work to support them and ended up back at it. He'd been arrested 8 times on illicit whiskey charges, but as she put it, it's all he knows. She testified that he paid Sheriff Thompson or Mr. Hyatt, whichever came for the pickup, $100 a week each, which is around $2,290 a week in today's money. Now think about how many defendants there are in this case, and imagine how much money these guys were earning. That's a lot of money. They called it payoff money, and it would be put in envelopes every week, one with the name Thompson written on it and one with Hyatt. Occasionally, Hyatt would also bring fruit jars and sugar, and he would collect whatever whiskey was made with his sugar. He also collected peach brandy on at least one occasion. Doc ran 2 stills. One was behind the home of fellow defendant Alfred Moultrie, and the other 2 miles from Walterboro Airport. Thompson and Hyatt would let them know when to be careful and when they didn't have to worry. That was part of the protection they paid for, being kept informed of possible raids. The other was for getting them out of arrests and getting sentences with the least amount of repercussions. There came a time when one of Doc's stills blew up, and so he wasn't able to operate for a while. Hyatt continued to come to collect the 2 payments every week. One day, Thompson came out to check on things and let Doc know that he didn't have to pay anything during the time he wasn't producing. Doc told Thompson that he'd been paying Hyatt all along. Thompson told Doc that this had happened before and that sometimes Hyatt wasn't giving him his full amount. Mrs. Freeman also testified that Doc had taken payments inside the Colleton County Courthouse to give to Sheriff Thompson. The most compelling bit of Mrs. Freeman's testimony revolved around a little blue spiral notebook. Doc may not have been able to read or write, but Mrs. Freeman was a very astute bookkeeper. She recorded every single transaction in her notebook. She also kept their money folded in a special way and pinned on the inside of her dress for safekeeping. There came a time when Sheriff Thompson reported to Doc that his still had been reported and to lay low, so Doc quit making whiskey until further notice. At this time, Mrs. Freeman had taken a job in North Carolina, so Doc was there alone. Thompson finally gave Doc the go-ahead, telling him that everything was clear, but everything was not clear. The still was raided by federal agents, and one of them, Henderson Clary, shot Doc during the raid. When Mrs. Freeman left, she'd left the money with Doc. It was $13,000 and their entire life savings. That's over $150,000 in today's money. $5,000 was her own, and $8,000 from Doc's whiskey making. Rather than keeping it on his person, he kept it in the pocket of a navy peacoat upstairs in the closet. With Doc in the hospital, and knowing the feds were there at his home, he immediately thought of this money and asked Sheriff Thompson to go to the house and retrieve it for him. He would come to realize that he would have been better off leaving the money where it was. Thompson sent deputies Hyatt and Carter to retrieve the money from the coat, but they came back empty-handed. The Freemans believed that the federal agents must have taken the money, and Mrs. Freeman asked Sheriff Thompson to help her get it back from them. Thompson told her he'd get Buster to handle it. Deputy Hyatt knew about Mrs. Freeman's little blue notebook and asked her to either give it to him or to burn it. She kept it. Buster himself, whom she'd never met previously, came out to see her, and they spoke for a while in the car. She asked him to help her press charges against the agent who shot her husband, and also to help her get some boys that had worked for them and had been arrested in the raid out of jail. After all, that's what the payoff money had been for, right? She told Buster about the money that had disappeared and asked him to help her get that back as well. Buster asked her for the notebook too, but again, she refused. When Doc's hospital bills came due, with all their savings gone and him no longer making whiskey, they were out of money, so she asked Hyatt for money to pay for it. After all, he'd been shot running the still. Hyatt gave them $500. When they got it, the Freemans were looking at it and noticed that it was folded in the special way she always had kept their money folded to pin in her dress. She reported this to Hyatt, who claimed he'd gotten it from the bank. He asked for it back, saying that he would take it back to the bank. She kept it. She saw Buster again, and he asked her for the $500 back, claiming that he would have the FBI run a trace on it. By then, the Freemans were very suspicious that Hyatt and Thompson had stolen her money, and so she refused, keeping the money. Buster and Thompson had agreed to have bond arranged for Doc when he left the hospital for his arraignment. They did not. Instead, Doc was taken straight to jail. Mrs. Freeman had to hire a lawyer for Doc, so she asked Deputy Hyatt again for the money. He gave her $2,000, but she needed another $3,000 for the case, so she sold her car and some property. Ultimately, after feeling so abandoned by Thompson, Hyatt, and Buster, Mrs. Freeman handed the little blue notebook over to federal agents and agreed to testify. The day ended a short time after defense began to question her, leading in the direction of her testifying out of spite because Buster had treated her brusquely at his office when she went to retrieve a bill of sale for her car, which she had given to him. Which brings us to Day 2. The buttermilk distraction. Day 2 begins with a second defendant coming forward to change his plea to guilty. Robert A. McPeak pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges. The trial continued with questioning of Mrs. Freeman. Their questions focused once again on the accusation that she was testifying because she was mad at Buster. They also attempted to entrap her with her own words, where she had told the court that if Buster, Thompson, and Hyatt told her not to admit knowing them, she would not have. They told the jury this proves she's willing to tell a falsehood. The court also heard from Malcolm Ewing, a retired agent for the U.S. Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division. He was part of the raid on the Freeman's home in Still. He testified to finding over a gallon of illegal whiskey, a large still, and almost 12 gallons of mash used for whiskey making. Ewing was one of the agents who had been left to guard the house after the raid. He said that deputies Hyatt and Carter had come to the house, left, and then come back again. When they entered the house, one of them had helped himself to the fridge, bringing out a carton of buttermilk and offering the agents a glass. They declined. In the meantime, the other deputy had gone upstairs for 3 to 5 minutes, while all the rest of them were downstairs. After he came back down, the deputies left. Freeman had told Thompson about the money. Thompson had sent his deputies, who claimed there was no money, and this agent's testimony sure makes it sound possible that one of them had gone straight for the coat in the closet, the coat that contained $13,000 that ended up missing, only for $500 of it to be returned to Mrs. Freeman when she asked Hyatt for money for Doc's hospital bills. I think it's pretty clear who took that money. Also testifying was bootlegger Joe Paget. Joe had been a bootlegger 20 years before and had left it to become a fisherman. He had recently returned to bootlegging when he asked defendant Berkeley Woods, a magistrate judge, for permission to set up a still. Woods introduced him to Sheriff Thompson to make the arrangements. Thompson asked him how much he could pay per month, and he told him $200. Thompson agreed and told him to find a location. Once in operation, the payments changed from cash to 10 cases of whiskey the first 2 months and 12 per month after that. The whiskey was to be divided between Magistrate Woods and Sheriff Thompson. Later, when 2 of Paget's helpers were arrested, Paget approached Thompson afraid that one of the boys, an Oscar Phillips, would tell everything while under arrest. Thompson told him if he could come up with $200, half for him and half for Buster, that he would try to get a light probation. Defense's strategy for this witness was to claim that he had exchanged his testimony for non-prosecution, stating that he had been indicted since 1953 and had never come up for trial, to which the witness denied, and the judge stated that it's possible the government may have simply delayed prosecution to lull him into a feeling of security and never actually have made a promise. There was testimony from Alfred Moultrie, whose home Freeman ran one of his stills behind. He testified that he had helped unload fruit jars from Deputy Hyatt's car into the Freeman house and also had helped load jars of whiskey into Hyatt's car on several occasions. The long day ended with testimony from Oscar Phillips, the very one Paget had been afraid of telling the agents everything. They didn't get too far into Oscar's testimony before calling it quits, but it was learned that Oscar had been convicted of bootlegging before and had been sentenced to a chain gang. For any who may not know what a chain gang is, there was a time prisoners were put to work during their time served. They performed menial, often hard labor jobs like clearing land or building railroads. They got the name from the fact that they were literally chained together by both ankles to ensure that no one could escape. Some states still use this into the 1970s, and it was brought back in the 90s, first in the state of Alabama, as part of a Tough on Crime initiative. Phillips, probably never wanting to go back to that, had become an undercover man for the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division after leaving prison in 1954. Day 2 ended on this testimony. The man in the trunk. Day 3 picks up again with the third change of plea to guilty when Robert Varnadoe, charged with 2 counts of whiskey violations and a conspiracy charge, pleaded guilty with the agreement to drop the 2 whiskey violations. Then, Oscar Phillips' testimony continued. During Oscar's testimony, defense counsel Edward Pritchett suddenly asked him, "Can I ask you a question without you going all through this memorized speech?" when he felt that the answers Phillips was giving were memorized. This reminded me so much of Alex's testimony when Creighton Waters commented about Alex's memorized answer that he kept repeating. Phillips told the court that he had asked Thompson if he could set up a still, and Thompson had given him some empty drums and a still cap, which he quickly showed the federal agents. He related being taken to work at a still site owned by Herman Ulmer, another defendant in this case. He named 2 other defendants, Curly Aiken and Harold Preacher, as workers there. When they finished making it, Ulmer and another defendant, Gaston Beach, came and picked the whiskey up. When they finished making it, Ulmer and another defendant, Gaston Beach, came and picked the whiskey up. Oscar hid Agent Henderson Clary in the trunk of a rented car, chosen to look like the car belonging to Oscar's son, Robert Phillips. Oscar invited Sheriff Thompson into his car, where they had a conversation about the stills. Agent Clary recorded the conversation from the trunk, and this evidence was said to be the biggest piece of evidence against the sheriff. Agent Clary is called next to testify and confirm the story. There were 2 problems with the recording that were addressed before his testimony. One being that the recording was not very clear, to which the judge instructed the jury to only pay attention to what they could clearly make out them saying for sure, and not to speculate about the parts they couldn't hear completely. The second problem was that Clary had fumbled the recorder and unplugged it, so he missed the very beginning of the conversation, to which defense tried to have it thrown out, claiming that it had to be the full recording. The judge ruled it permissible nonetheless, but none of the newspapers reported on what was exactly on the tape. But at least the tape documented Thompson having a conversation with the bootlegger about the stills. Another bootlegger and co-defendant, Lucius Evans, testified that he made 2 protection payoffs to 2 Colleton deputies and had paid Hyatt $15 to retrieve a still condenser that had been seized in a raid. Lucius and Deputy David Carter had driven to Sheriff Thompson's house to pick up the retrieved condenser. He testified about a chain of whiskey still operations and their locations, and told the court that he had gotten permission from Thompson to set up a still with the agreement to pay 2 cases a week of whiskey. When he didn't pay, his still was wrecked. He set up another outfit, agreeing to pay $75 a week for protection to the plantation manager where the still was located. They set it up, and he paid the money. Later, Sheriff Thompson told him to relocate because Platt, the plantation manager, wasn't giving Thompson his share of the money. Lucius had set up yet another still, which was called a community still because it was used by 5 men. That still was raided, and one of the men, James Hayward, was arrested. Thompson told Evan he could get the case squashed for $500. Later, Deputy Sheriff Riddick Herndon took him to Eugene DeWitt's farm, where they set up a distillery with the agreement to pay DeWitt $15 per week and Deputy Sheriff Herndon 3 cases of whiskey. Herndon himself ran a still with co-defendant Ulmer. They operated there for 3 months until they got word that the feds were aware of it, and they cut it up as they were told to do. Defense came back with the same line, that he had been offered a deal to testify, which Lucius, like all the others, denied. George Hired testified next that he had allowed Paget to set up a still on his property because he was promised $150 a week. Thompson agreed to it for the payoff of 2 cases per week, and it's this testimony that gives us a peek into how much tax these operations avoided. The still's capacity was 120 cases per week and operated for 14 weeks. The federal tax rate of $10.50 per gallon put that at more than $100,000 in lost taxes. That's over $1,156,000 in today's money in just 14 weeks out of one still. These were very long court days, operating until 10 at night and half days on Saturdays. This was the judge's orders to keep this trial from lasting too long, so testimony continued with Robert Phillips, the son of Oscar Phillips, the undercover man who had assisted in the recording of Sheriff Thompson by Agent Clary. Robert testified that he had been arrested for making whiskey, but his father told him that he would get him out by paying Magistrate Woods $300. Oscar and Robert's grandpa, Pascal Bishop, had gotten the money and paid it to Woods, who was supposed to split it with Deputies Hyatt and Carter. Robert Phillips was released, given back his car, and had never been indicted. And that brought Day 3 to an end. We'll continue in Episode 9, Bootlegging Buster Part 3, coming soon. Till then, this is Cassidy O'Connell saying stay well and stay tuned.